Hey everyone, I'm Keegs, and today I want to continue on with part 3 in Batman the Black Mirror epic, and this is the issue Lost Boys. If you want to start from the beginning, you can click up here and that'll take you to my part 1 video, but for now, let's get into everything that happened in the events from this run. This issue is actually a parallel story, where in the first part, it's about a crime scene, and there's the Peter Pan killer who is taking kids or at least they're going missing, and the windows are left open after they're discovered missing. So that's kind of how we got the name, as it's a similar story to Peter Pan. But then this story is actually broken into two parts in itself, where 20 years ago, when James Jr., Jim Gordon's son, is a kid, Jim is trying to solve this string of kid disappearances, and he was never able to solve it. So that's kind of the first part of the first half, and then the second part of the first half of the story is in current day stuff, which takes place about 20 years later or so, where Jim is then going after the Peter Pan killer again, and he thinks he's found the guy. The other side of the parallel story focuses on James Jr., and he's kind of a weird dude, and it focuses on his interactions mainly with the Gordon family, which is going to include Jim Gordon, Barbara Gordon, other Barbara Gordon, who I'm just going to refer to as James's mother because I don't want it to get too confusing with two Barbaras. So James's mother calls up Jim and says, like, hey, something's not right with our son. We tested him for autism. He doesn't have that. I don't know what it is. Meanwhile, James Jr. is sitting at the top of the stairs looking creepy as hell. He's obviously a psychopath. I mean, just from that one interaction. Flash forward to the current day, and Jim's in his car talking about how there are some cases that just haunt you that never get solved and you can't stop thinking about it. And for him, the Peter Pan killer was one of these cases. So he's now tailing someone who he believes might be the killer that he couldn't catch all those years ago. Back in the past again, the Gordons are going on vacation, and now they have Barbara Gordon with them as well, and her best friend, Bess. And they talk about having this science kit that each of them hold a key to, and they can only unlock it if they're together, to which James Jr. makes a really ominous statement of like, hey, what if one of you is no longer around, and how would you open it then? And the girls look at him and say like, what the heck, man, that's a weird thing to say, and they just kind of brush it off. But surprise, surprise, later that night, or at least in that trip, she goes missing. Bess does. They all end up searching for Bess all night, except for James Jr., who stays in the house, and then Barbara Gordon goes to her father, or uncle, and says, hey, I think I saw him, James Jr., with Bess's keys. I think he might have done something to her. And Jim doesn't really want to believe it, but also kind of does because he knows something's off with his son. So he goes to check on James, and he finds James trying to break into the science kit that he talked about earlier, saying, I'm doing an experiment to see if I can get in myself, which is a really weird thing to say. And then Jim freaks out on him and says, what did you do? Where is she? What did you do with Bess? And James says, it wasn't me. I've just been up here trying to break into this thing. And he doesn't admit to anything. Flashing back forward now, Jim is talking about this dude. And the reason he thinks that this guy named Roy is the Peter Pan killer is because the string of disappearances stopped as soon as this guy went to jail. And now he thinks this guy's out on the hunt again. So he eventually ends up confronting Roy, and they get into a bit of a scuffle. And in that scuffle, Roy says, hey, I know all those years ago that you were hunting me, so I thought, you know what? Maybe I'm going to go after you instead. And I'm going to go get your youngest son, or your only son, and I'm going to take him away from you, just like you're trying to catch me and put me in jail. And he ends up actually talking to James Jr., and he gets like kind of creeped out by James Jr. and says, I'm not going to do that actually. And they don't actually explicitly say that this is the guy that took Bess, but it's heavily implied that he is actually the one who took Bess, and perhaps he saw James Jr., figured, something about this kid, I don't want to take him, something's not right, and decides to go after someone else instead. I also think it's way more likely that this is the guy that took Bess because he happened to be at the same place and the same time when Bess went missing. And really, it's not super realistic, I feel like, that James Jr. at this point in his life was capable of killing someone. Not that he wouldn't have wanted to. He definitely would have wanted to. But I think logistically, it doesn't make any sense. He's 10 years old. How is he going to kill this girl, drag her body out, go bury it somewhere in the woods, then come back to the house covered in dirt and blood probably, go take a shower without anybody seeing that or questioning where he was all that time? It seems incredibly unlikely. I think more likely the Peter Pan killer, Roy, just saw James Jr. at some point and said, here's a memento, here's a key, or gave it to him for some reason after he had killed Bess. But I think it's more likely that Roy did it because I just don't think a 10-year-old boy could have done that. I mean, just imagine the amount of time he would have had to been gone for that. Somebody would have noticed his absence. This is a pretty eerie story, though, because it's kind of really rooted in real life situations and things that could potentially and probably do happen in real life. And I also think it's pretty sad that Bess's body is never found or discovered, even throughout this story. So it is a little depressing in that sense. Overall, though, this story was pretty good, and it gives a good backstory to James Jr. and his mental capabilities and thought processes for the stories to come. I wish there was a little more Batman in it, since, I mean, he wasn't in it at all in this Batman issue, but I think he's going to be heavily involved in the forthcoming issues. So let me know down in the comments, what do you think? Do you think James killed Bess, or do you think it was actually Roy and Jim did end up finding the guy at the end of this story? I'd love to know what you think. Let me know down in the comments. I'm Keegs, and I hope to catch you all again for part 4 in the Batman Black Mirrors epic.